Thank you so much. I'm really, really excited for today's discussion. Thinking about how we use AI as one of the key challenges I think that we're facing. And often we think a lot about the uses of it, but we don't often think about how it actually gets to be used and those processes behind it. And procurement and supply chain is a really big component of that. And so we have some amazing experts here today to kind of bring us through that and really raise some awareness about some of the opportunities and challenges related to procuring AI in a safe and responsible way. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our first panelist, Sue Williams, who is the Managing Director of Hexagon. Welcome, Sue. And they'll all introduce themselves and the amazing work that they do. And so next, we have the team leads of projects for the Center of Data Ethics and Innovation, Mark Durkee. Thanks, Mark. And please give a warm welcome to Seth Dobrin, who is the Global Chief AI Officer at IBM. And finally, we have Joel Walker, who is the co-founder and COO of the Knowledge Group.
Good morning.
Welcome, everyone. So, as discussed, we have, as you'll tell from all of their backgrounds soon, quite a distinguished group of experts to really help us understand how AI is being used to help advance procurement, and also what some of the different types of interventions that are needed when thinking about procuring AI, because it is different than other different types of technologies. So with that, would love each of you to share a little bit more about your background and why you're particularly interested in this topic. Sue, we'll start with you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Sue Williams. I'm a supply chain consultant working in supply chain and procurement for over 25 years, including working with modelling and the procurement and also the design of models.
Hi, I'm Mark Durkee. I work for an organisation called the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. We're a team within the UK government who look at ethical responsible use of data issues across public and private sector. Some of our work includes thinking about the ecosystem around assuring AI and helping people to work out whether things that they buy actually do what they think they do, meet sensible standards of ethics and responsibility. And we also work closely with lots of teams across the UK public sector, helping them think about how they buy AI in a sensible way and how they use it in a sensible way.
I'm Seth Dobrin. I'm IBM's Global Chief AI Officer. And this topic is very near and dear, not just to my heart, but also to IBM's heart. I always tell people that a bad day for AI for anyone is a bad day for all of us. And so I think it's really important that when we look at procuring and using AI, we do it in a way that's explainable, transparent, secure, and helps preserve privacy. And that's a really important topic in procurement and supply chain as well.
Thanks, Joel.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Joel Walker. I'm the Chief Operations Officer of a procurement organisation called the Knowledge Group. Prior to helping build this business, I spent 10 years buying things for Vodafone. So I was the global head of procurement for corporate services based in Luxembourg, buying about 1.5 billion euros a year's worth of things. Everything that wasn't technology in simple terms. So if it had wires in it, I wasn't responsible for it, but lots of other things I was. So my role now is building a digital procurement business that's helping match suppliers with buyers and providers. And we're experimenting with different ways of using AI in some of the matching algorithms in the new organization.
So Joel, we'll keep with you actually, because I think that's a great way to open up this dialogue. And I've asked all the panelists to be as practical as possible. So just a reminder, and using good use cases. Can you explain how AI is really changing the way that goods are procured?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. There's a wider philosophical debate, I think, around where procurement best sits within an organization. But most typically, I think, we find it rolls up most often and most commonly into a finance function. Anyone that knows finance knows there's always lots of numbers. Numbers turn into data. And any environment with huge amounts of data, which big procurement organizations typically have, I think some of the practical use cases for the application of AI are coming in that interrogation of data. I think to be very specific, there's probably two distinct spheres, some of which are more easily quantified. So where you can apply AI technology into the contracting space, into risk management, into supplier identification. And those are all sort of pre-award, they're in the research phase, and even after, so contract management, accounts payable, invoice reconciliation. There's huge amounts of AI organizations and firms now building discrete bits of capability to be applied into those use cases. And I think that's having a transformative effect, actually, which leads to the second, less quantifiable benefit, which is the time that's saved in organizations through the automation of what was previously fairly mundane activity that was either impossible or very expensive to do. Gives you a capacity that you can either choose to release and take some benefit if you're driving a business case for financial return, which is always one avenue. The second one is to reinvest the time that you've created. You've freed up from people's time. You're presenting them with more data and turning that data into intelligence and knowledge, which drives action. And that's where you can it starts to have an impact in terms of innovation and organizational change. And I think any procurement organization that isn't using AI today is wasting huge amounts of time and resource, and it's not driving the business value that I think is expected of a modern procurement team.
And maybe, Seth, one of the things that, so Joel's talked a lot about how we're using AI to improve the procurement process. Do you want to maybe speak a little bit to just procuring AI solutions themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So I think that when you think about procurement and AI, there's multiple aspects to it. So one is, how does AI impact procurement itself, which everyone else on the panel here is much more of an expert than I am in the space. There's who are the humans that are impacting the AI that's going to be used in the supply chain, and then there's procuring the AI itself. I think we often forget about those three, that there are three parts to it. So there needs to be some responsibility on vendors that are selling AI to companies, so pre-built AI that's supposed, out of the box commodity type AI, and to make sure that that AI is explainable, that it doesn't present any bias, that it's protecting the underlying data, that those models cannot be impacted by bad actors to extract information from them or cause them to make unfair decisions. And so that's one aspect of it. I think, more critical or equally as critical is what impact does AI that's being used in the procurement pipeline have on the humans that are involved in that procurement pipeline. So for instance, if you're using AI to select a vendor and it's helping you to pick the best vendor, how are you factoring in bias? How are you factoring underserved communities economically, socially, et cetera? How do you ensure that those things are part of the AI model? And how do you present an explainability? So if there is in the US a Black-owned business and they didn't get selected, they can then question, why didn't we get selected? And they can get an answer, and it had nothing to do with, it's very black and white, but very, very clear cut why that choice was selected.
Yeah.
And so I think that those are humans that are being impacted there, and there's actually humans that are being impacted on the use of it. So the people in the corporates or the organizations who are using the AI, were they part of the process? Do they understand what impact it's going to have on them? Do they understand how it's going to make their lives better, cheaper, or faster? And essentially, the whole thesis around responsible use of AI for me is anytime AI is impacting the health, wealth, or livelihood of a human, you need to have those controls over it, and there should be some level of oversight, whether it's regulatory or otherwise. That's not for me to decide.
Thanks. And Sue, as a supply chain expert, is there anything that you want to add in terms of how AI is changing the landscape of procurement, supply chain?
I think there's a couple of points when we start to look at the, it's going to shift things for the vendors as well. So there is the need to look at bias in the systems and making sure the selection process, but it's also about how those vendors then engage in that. It's going to be a different sales environment for them. So it's not just going to be the traditional way of perhaps accessing the markets. They're going to have to find different ways of making sure they're part of that selection process. So I think it's going to shift the dynamics on both sides, both the sales and the procurement side. And I also think there is more to think about for the smaller businesses in particular that perhaps haven't got some of the systems and capability of the larger organizations, and making sure they've still got a fair playing field.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And the work that we've done at the Responsible AI Institute is working with organizations like U.S. Department of Defense to understand what are the different intervention points that need to exist within a procurement process. And this was really stemming from the work that we did in the Government of Canada, where I used to lead a lot of these efforts. So, Mark, I'm just wondering, similarly, as Sue mentioned, one of the things that we really wanted to understand was how to make the process equitable and really understand that a lot of AI companies are often startups or smaller companies. Is that something that you're thinking about at CDEI?
Yeah, and I guess one of the big challenges here is that when people are buying AI, they often don't really realise they're buying AI. So I, in my day job, use AI every day, every hour probably. We use G Suite email. My email is autocomplete. I search through my email because it's massively disorganised. There are lots and lots of quite complicated bits of AI built into my day that I use all the time, and no one ever bought that as AI. Our procurement team in DCMS who went and bought a system didn't think I was buying AI. They thought, I'm buying an email system, I'm buying an office suite. And there are lots of bits of AI that are built into all of that. And I think it is difficult when you're thinking about how to deal with issues like bias to think all the way through the supply chain. So it isn't often good enough to say, only when I'm buying AI do I need to worry about bias in AI, do I need to worry about openness to different vendors. We need to be applying some of that thinking when we're buying lots and lots of things, because lots of tech products have got AI built in somewhere in the supply chain. And generally speaking, the examples I gave are not particularly problematic and risky ones, but you could imagine situations where they might be. Emails that autocomplete in ways that you don't want them to. You send around the world, that could actually be quite problematic in some situations.
Yeah.
And I think there are, where we're struggling as a community perhaps to get to the maturity level quickly is thinking about how we flow through some of the requirements, some of the expectations around thinking about bias, thinking about fairness, thinking about privacy, all the way back through supply chains, right the way back to kind of people who have produced models back at the beginning.
Yeah.
And in the case of Google, it may not be a great example because Google sort of own the whole stack, but in lots of situations, people might have bought a component from another organisation, which might be small and might not be well understood, might be an academic group who have built something and commercialised it. It then flows through into a big corporate product, and how you follow that chain through is not very straightforward.
No, it's a good point, and balancing that, how do you help get people and those academics into the market to do that, but also decoupling the fact that maybe these technologies are not the same when they're being bundled in. Seth, as a technology service provider, is that something that IBM thinks about at all?
Yeah, I mean, IBM, we take this extremely seriously. In fact, we take it so seriously that the base of almost all of our technology in the space, we open source. And so it's, like I said at the beginning, a bad day, our feeling and our stance is a bad day for anyone in this field is a bad day for all of us. And so, it's critically important that we acknowledge that AI is almost everything we interact with these days to some extent. And that creates a challenge because we want to think about things like this, but at the same time, where do we start? And it gets back to my statement earlier that we really need to ensure that when the health, wealth, and livelihood of a human is involved, that's where we start, because that's the most important thing, right? So I have Alexa in my house. I can use it just fine. My wife tries to talk to it. 70% of the time, it doesn't understand her. Is that wrong? Absolutely. Is it going to harm her in the long run? No. Is it annoying? Absolutely. So I think, in the long run, we need to work on that. But right now, we need to ensure when people are being awarded contracts for procurement, it's done fair. When supply chains are being done or being optimized, it's done fairly. And when people are using that, it's used in a way that is transparent to them. And so I think those are really the areas from a technology and delivery perspective that we need to focus on, because we can't solve everything at once.
So Joel is somebody, thanks Seth. Joel is somebody that's spent a lot of time in procurement and then now is thinking about this from an AI perspective. How do you see your business shifting, or what types of challenges are you trying to overcome?
Well, I think the fact that I think there's one spare seat here proves that well, there is one seat here if you need. But the fact that there's only one or two seats free, I think is symptomatic of an intellectual curiosity on the topic. And I think there are emerging frameworks now, via the Responsible AI Institute, that are starting to provide frameworks or templates to organisations at least to signpost some of the considerations that you need to be considering. I think we're still at the foot of the mountain in terms of understanding the full capability, and all of the use cases are still unfolding in front of us. But from a procurement perspective, in the old days, you would bang the desk, shout, create competition, leverage price. In the AI space, it's a lot more around value and protecting, I think, to build on Seth's point, protecting the health and wealth of the community that have been impacted by it. And from someone that used to buy solutions, I think there's a certain level of frustration that no one knows quite what's within the black box. So from a clean sheet accounting or from a cost tear down perspective, trying to understand what you should be paying for a solution. It's fine that a supplier says it costs this, but actually that's their aspiration. There's clearly a gap between their aspiration often and what you're prepared to pay. And it's almost impossible often to peel back the layers around what's contained within that solution. And I think coming to a more specific answer, some of the emerging themes now are much more around gain share and outcome-based commercial models. I think at the start it was a black box with a license fee and some expensive professional services wrapped around it to help you get the value from it. And I think as service providers have become more comfortable, as buyers have started to understand the opportunities and pitfalls in procuring solutions like this, we're maturing as a profession in this emerging space to be able to say, well, what does good look like in terms of a commercial model? So contractually, it's fairly straightforward, but it's how are you buying it in terms of the commercial remuneration, the reward, the incentive, and I think that's where some of the exciting stuff happens, because that starts to bind the service provider into the success of that implementation. So success is measured in real outcomes, in whatever they may be, rather than how many days were billed on the activity. So to your question on emerging themes, I think certainly that transition from time and materials towards outcome-based, I think is a key theme that we'll see more and more of actually as we start to understand it a little better.
Yeah, and you started to mention these guardrails, and I definitely want to get into that. But maybe over to Sue and to Mark, just maybe, can you share a few specific examples for the audience before we get into what type of oversight is required for different types of AI systems being procured? Mark, you've spoken to it being bundled into kind of back office a little bit, but are there other examples you can provide to where some of these concerns are coming to the table?
Yeah, so I guess, and maybe it's worth thinking of a couple of groups of use cases that are increasingly being looked at within the UK public sector, and I'm sure in lots of other contexts as well. In my head, it's quite useful to think about two groups. There's a group of commodity or increasingly commodity AI tools, so things like image recognition, facial recognition, natural language processing, which increasingly are built by a few big tech companies. IBM are one of those, of course, and there are others. Where people are buying a commodity tool. They're buying a chatbot to plug into a website. They're buying a facial recognition tool to recognize faces in some contexts, and some interesting ethical issues around some of those potential use cases. There's also another group of use cases that is quite different in nature for procurement, where people are looking to build something that usually gets called AI, and you can debate whether it is or not, which is more like risk analysis, statistical analysis based on a bunch of an organization's own data. So they might buy a team in to have a look at their data, perhaps build a risk assessment tool, and people are experimenting in areas like law enforcement very tentatively, children's social care. We in CDR have a little bit of work looking at assessment of risk in social care context, which is a very pressing and very, very challenging issue to accurately assess when children or adults indeed are at risk of harm. It's very difficult to do it in a human way. There are some interesting opportunities for using better data to help assess that risk. People call it AI. I think it's very debatable if it is really. It's statistical modelling, but I think a lot of the same issues apply. A lot of the issues around bias, around privacy, around interpreting the output sensibly as part of an overall human decision-making process. And I think for those kinds of tools, we have access to quite a lot more information when we procure. So we're either thinking about procuring some people and talking about competence of individuals. Do the individuals have the right skills, the right training, the right understanding of some of these issues? Or we're able to think quite carefully about measuring what the model does against demographic data, against other things. I think in some of the commodity space, if you're buying a facial recognition tool, often it's quite difficult to get under the skin of what has been done to that before you buy it. It's a commodity off-the-shelf product. You can ask some questions. There are not very good habits about what kind of information providers of these commodity tools provide to the market. I think it would be good if, as an ecosystem, we could get into a sort of slightly more coherent understanding of, if you're selling a commodity AI tool like that, what are the things you should expect to communicate to the market to tell them what it does and how you've tested it. I think that's something that it is developing, but it's got quite a long way to go as compared to other spaces.
Yeah. Seth, you.
So
I do want to come back to
you brought up a couple of really, really important parts that I think are critical that we understand. So first and foremost, when we think about AI, we're really talking about decisions. And so that extends what you talk about, even in the state of New York, where one of the first regulations is enacted around hiring, it's actually decisioning systems, not specifically called out as AI. So I think that's really important. Now, and that's important because when you look at AI systems, we often think about AI as biased. And when you break down what AI is, it's math. And there's only one or two people in the world that would argue with me on this, I think, but math is not inherently biased. The bias that exists in the AI models that are created are captured, are trained into the math from the data. And databases which store data are not themselves inherently biased. The bias comes from the past decisions of humans. And so whether you're using AI to make a decision, or you're using human-generated rules, or you're using human-generated risk assessments, there is bias that's going to be introduced into the system. And it's our onus as leaders in the space is to measure, detect, and remediate that bias to something that's acceptable to us as corporates and governments, and to the societies that we operate in. And so those are really important aspects of this that we often forget, but reinforce exactly what you said. And that gets to institutes like RAE and regulation. As companies, as governments, absent regulation or in the context of regulation, how do we have some reassurance that we're doing the right things? Today, companies are saying, I want to do this. How do I do it? And consumers are demanding it. Lots of CPG companies are coming to us saying, we need help. We don't know what to do to satisfy consumers and give them some assurance.
Right, and that's it, Mark, exactly what you were talking about really reminded me of the challenge that we had in the Government of Canada, where we're really trying to understand how do you pre-qualify vendors to think about, because departments were coming to us as a central agency asking, well, who's doing AI? What are they doing? And for a variety of different reasons, in addition to what you've talked about, we had Canadian Railways that was putting monitors on the train to avoid derailments. It really spans the gamut. And that's why, Sue, I think that your background in the supply chain work that you've done really in manufacturing processes, I think is quite different. We think about it in terms of these analytics tools, the decision making, but there's implications there as well.
There is. So the kind of work I'm often doing is around digital twins for supply chains and operations, and using AI and machine learning to understand how best to optimize that. That might be for predictive maintenance or other decision making. So there isn't directly necessarily a human at the end of that, but there may be some people being displaced, or you're making decisions around how to spend an organization's money, how to distribute the resources. So they're big decisions for companies. And also I think when they're procuring systems and making decisions around it, they're not really sure, again, about what this black box is going to do for them, and making sure that they're investing what is quite a lot of money for a number of these organizations into something that's going to give them proper value add back out of that they're actually going to benefit from it as an organization, as well as making sure they've thought about the wider implications of its use. So I think there is definitely that human lens, but there's also just practical application of this kind of capability into business decision making.
Completely. And one of the big things that we've done is, as Seth and Joel were mentioning, is think about what a framework to evaluate different types of AI systems are, including ones being procured. And so would really love to get all of your thoughts, and then we'll transition to questions, so get your questions ready, into what needs to be included or thought about when thinking about guardrails for AI procurement. maybe Sue, I'll start with you and we'll go down.
Well, for me, procurement is a really important pivot point between the vendors and the advisors around AI and then the consumers of AI. So having structure and thought and standards at that point means it's going to ripple up and down the supply chain. You're going to have vendors who will use that as a principle perhaps to gain some competitive advantage. They're going to have these standards and therefore be able to promote themselves differently from one who hasn't got it. And also vendors building it into their procurement processes will encourage procurers buying it, will encourage those vendors to go through that process and demonstrate their capability in that area. So I think it's a hugely important point, a place in the supply chain for standards and assurances.
Yeah, it's maybe building on that a little bit actually and thinking about kind of what standards are most helpful at that point of procurement. I think there's a couple of areas where there's loads of good work going on in standards groups and elsewhere, which could be quite useful in the coming years. So there's a piece around competence for managing AI, and if we look at comparisons in areas like cybersecurity and quality management, an awful lot of the standardization that happens in procurement is about, are you a competent organization who are managing it in a sensible way? You've got people in place, you've got processes in place. So in cybersecurity, there is ISO 27001, which it's not perfect by any means, but achieves quite a lot in helping people at least think about the basic competence of an organization. There are moves afoot to have an equivalent AI management standard, which I think could be quite useful for lots of organizations. And then the other half, I think, is just this point around a common language for communicating what you've done with an individual model and individual AI tool. There were lots of really good work, for example, around measuring bias, lots of measurement techniques for defining how to measure bias statistically. We don't have very good habits for how to communicate those with boardrooms, how to communicate those with procurement decision makers. I think almost the field is too broad at the moment. We could almost do with a little bit of focus on a smaller number of techniques that as a machine learning community we're communicating out and saying, this is how you should think about this. Here are 2 or 3 options rather than 20 or 30 options. And that would be quite helpful, I think, to getting a bit of consistency in the supply chain.
Yeah, and it's great that you're mentioning the need for standards. One of the things that we've just announced is that our procurement framework, or our framework for responsible AI, is being evaluated by Standards Council of Canada and UCAS. And Seth, something that we've been working on with IBM is going to be related to how do you use tooling to evaluate that. Can you kind of share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so on that, plus the need for standards, I think Mark and Sue laid out pretty well. But Mark and Sue also called out some important pieces where there's actually 3 parts when you're procuring AI. So you're going to buy AI, you're going to build AI, and you're going to use AI. And if you think about it in that context, when you buy AI, it's generally for a specific purpose. So a use case. Workday is for HR, Salesforce is for a CRM system. So you need to govern it in the context, whether it's regulatory or within a corporate or organizational framework, you need to govern it around that context. And that's what the EU is proposing with the upcoming EU Act, is it's all outcome-based, which gets to your general purpose AI that you were talking about. You really can't regulate or govern general purpose AI because what's it going to be used for? I can't think of a reason, but there could be bias that exists and you need it to solve a problem. What that problem is, I don't know, but it could solve a problem for you, and so it needs to be in there. But in the context of matching a human, I'm going through the automated gates here in the UK, it should be able to recognize my face just as it should anyone else's face, whether you're a woman, whether you're from India or Africa, doesn't matter. Should be equal. But it's the use that matters. Yeah. And so what we're doing at IBM with the Responsible AI Institute is we're looking at how we surface that in the context of specific use cases in a programmatic way to make it easy for organizations to implement it, not just from a technical perspective, but also, to your point, at the boardroom. How can we surface this information at the boardroom, and how can we surface this information to regulators and auditors who just are not experts in this space, but can ask very specific, relevant questions and get non-technical, yet very specific answers.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Joel?
I guess I'm keen to get to the question, so maybe just to be concise. I think, to repeat a phrase of earlier, we are at the foot of the mountain in terms of discovery here. And in some senses, because it's new, it's interesting. Those with intellectual curiosity are starting to explore it. But there's also, the need to a sense of the emperor's new clothes wrapped around it, and that is, there's an old RPA solution, an old automation solution, slap an AI label on it, and we can resell that. So I think there's an expectation now, well, what's your story around AI? So as a functional director in a customer operations environment, or in a finance function, or in a manufacturing space, tell me, you're being pushed as a leader for, what are the use cases where AI could apply? I don't know. and there's opportunistic sales organizations that will be putting labels on things that say AI that clearly aren't AI, that don't have the intelligence which differentiates them from other sorts of automation. And I think that's where there's a role for advisory services, government bodies, institutes that help create a framework to guide that narrative, because it is complex. Organizations like Hexagon, IBM, ourselves, we're all doing our own little bit in that space. There are experts emerging for very discrete pieces of activity. Certainly IBM, dwarf what we do, but we're all on that journey. And I think as buyers of procurement, people are needing to start to access that talent and to start to bring external advice in to help guide them. Otherwise, there's going to be people with fingers burned. And then, remember the old Gartner hype cycle, you get to that trough of disillusionment where everyone's expectations are hugely inflated by the expectations of what AI can do. They go and spend a lot of money on something that may or may not be AI without the expert advice. And then it's, well, hang on, the business case isn't realized, the benefits case crumbles, someone loses their job, the next guy comes in, I need an AI story, okay, fine. And you just get into this vicious cycle. So I think, it's time now for us as a community at events like this to come together, to be collaborative, come and talk to us afterwards around how we can help, because I think there's huge amounts we can do through collaboration.
I think that's a great call to action. And just maybe if you have a question, put your hand up. And as we get there, we just have one in the front here. We have to wait for the microphone. As we do that, some of the work that we're doing with international organizations like the World Economic Forum is leveraging their efforts through the procurement in a box to really think about, as I said earlier, what are those intervention points? One of the things we've crafted is a statement to be included in a master services agreement that requires responsible AI activities, and it helps to just create or start the dialogue. So yeah, happy to talk about these things more. Go ahead.
Hi, I guess the question is to Mark and Seth. I was thinking more in terms of security, and especially in governments here in the more developed world, but mostly in the developing world, where this artificial intelligence can be used to discriminate against people and use that kind of data. So where do we put in systems in place? Where is it developers, vendors, and then they can be persecuted as well. So there's harm to the community.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I have a few perspectives on that. So one is, as any entity that is using AI, you need a set of principles, or selling AI. What are your principles that you're going to live by? So at IBM, we were one of the first, if not the first company to establish an AI ethics board. And our AI ethics board sets guardrails for the company and makes it very clear what we will and will not do, both internally and externally. In fact, one of the first things we did as an AI ethics board was we said, we are no longer going to sell general purpose facial recognition software, which then led to the rest of the industry following, because we don't think the technology is right or ripe for it yet. And even if it were, is it really the right thing to do? So things like that, setting guardrails. And a company like IBM, with the AI ethics board, which I'm a member of, we also interact and review any project where AI is being used that affects the health, wealth, or livelihood of a human. And we provide guidance to the teams, whether it's a software team or a consulting team, that you need to change this aspect of this agreement because it doesn't align with our ethics. We've actually shut down projects because it did not align with our ethical principles, which is rare for a company. And so the ethics board is important, but an ethics board that has teeth. So our ethics board is mandated by our business conduct guidelines or alignment to the ethics board. And so from my perspective, that's the best way we as a vendor, how we can protect, interactions like that. I think there's a whole nother aspect of this where there's things that can happen. I mentioned it earlier about poisoning AI models. What are you doing to protect your model? And assurances and certifications like the ones that the Responsible AI Institute is building are important to that because it's not a one and done thing. It needs to be renewed. It needs to be constantly reviewed. Whatever the standards bodies or the regulators require, that's your base. And as a company, you need to decide for this use case, is that frequent enough? And so I think there's no programmatic way to protect. It's all process and us ensuring that as people who are executing these and helping others execute, that we're doing what we think is the right thing and we're helping our customers to do what they think is the right thing.
So Mark, I don't know if you want to add anything. We have another question over here.
So maybe it's very brief. I think it is an incredibly difficult issue. I think I endorse what Seth said earlier, that the right way of thinking about regulating and governing AI is about the way in which you're using it. And in free democratic countries, we hope that people will make good decisions about how they will use. There are good use cases where facial recognition is appropriate and helpful. There are probably some use cases where it isn't. And it's best to make those decisions. It is really difficult to translate that to the wider world. And I think it is tricky to do it at the vendor level simply because the bar to entry is not that high for a lot of these technologies. So it is not as though if a small number of vendors were prevented by their host countries from doing it, it would necessarily have that much impact because there are loads of other vendors out there. There are loads of open source tools out there which you could probably do the same thing with. So I suspect the solution is probably more, thinking more broadly about how to improve the way people are treated around the world. It's tricky to do that in a kind of pure AI context. It's a bit of a personal opinion, maybe that, but it's not an easy solution.
What you could do is put terms and conditions, right? So anytime you consume any of our object detection, there's a term and condition that you can't use it for mass surveillance.
Right.
And so it's have to protect us, but also have to set guidelines to our customers as to what we think is right and don't.
And one of the things we found is that we're talking about these things in an unintended consequence way. Nobody's setting out often to do it maliciously. It's trying to put these guardrails in place to understand that those conversations need to be had so we can avoid that. Go ahead.
So I'm going to admit something, and I hope no one outside this room will tell anyone, but I occasionally watch science fiction.
We all did.
Well, no one in these conversations ever seems to actually reference Star Trek, the robots trilogies, all this stuff. And the abiding lesson of science fiction and of history, we go back to any number of the crossbow, chemical weapons, is that if a society decides not to adopt a technology, it will, I was going to say quite a rude word then, it will suffer consequences from societies that do. Sometimes that society may cease to exist. So part of my question is, why do we not reference these things? But also, does what we think really matter? When people talk about the democracies, we're talking Western Europe, and not even all of that now, and North America. We are a minority, and there's people not very far from us who do not share these things. And whereas IBM, the corporation, can control to an extent what happens to its systems, having worked several years at the labs, I then took what I learned elsewhere. I didn't do anything very bad with it, mostly. But once these skills are out there, Open source projects, I can write code, I can adapt it to do what you define as bad things. And our values are not universal. Not at all. They're not even universal within our societies. So why do our opinions matter, except to say things like this at conferences?
Well, hence the guardrails. Joel, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think there was a few points there that I'll try and tease out, and maybe have time for a couple more questions afterwards. I think your primary, the first part of the question, which is around why we're not talking around the sci-fi nature of AI just yet, is that there's a huge gap between intelligent AI and where we are at the moment, which is this sort of weak AI, which is the very, it's, you know, aside, if we'd had this conference last week and the Google guy hadn't been put on leave for saying that their AI bot was developing a sense of sentiment, I think we're still an awful long way away from the rise of the machines, and therefore the gap between the practical applications for AI today and what we saw on Star Trek is still a huge chasm to cross. So I think, so the first part of my question is, I think we're a long way away from that yet. The second part of your question, which was more around the risks associated to intellectual property leaks from code out into the wider population and the risks associated with that, I think that's exactly why, and again, I'm not a salesman for the Responsible AI Institute, but some of their work that they're doing with government bodies are that those government bodies and transnational bodies, in fact, like the UN and the OECD and these sorts of organizations are becoming increasingly concerned about that. How to protect against that? I think we're still at the start of that conversation, and I don't think there's a perfect answer just yet.
I think science fiction's a bad analogy for this. I think there's lessons we can learn, but as humans, we tend to anthropomorphize things. We say animals that don't have emotions or probably don't have emotions have emotions. People even feel like plants have emotions. And I think, we need to be careful not to anthropomorphize AI. We've been saying for the last 50 years that, this general AI is going to be here in 50 years. I'm still saying it's going to be another 50 years. There's a lot of things we know that need to happen, and there's even more things that we don't know that need to happen for that to be realized. Science fiction, because it's selling an entertainment thing, it tends to inflate the impact. It tends to sensationalize it, just like some media companies do. And so we need to focus on what we can control and what we can't control. Science fiction gets us into the world of things that we just can't control.
So we have 3 questions here. Maybe I'll just really quickly get you to ask all of them, and then everybody can respond with their last minute rapid fire round. Perfect. Thanks for all the enthusiasm. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to say that in answer to that question about why we're talking about it is a lot of us need to know. I think there are various stakeholders and we all need education. So even though those obviously writing the programs, those using the programs, every stakeholder needs to be aware. And so forums like this enable all of us to kind of upskill and learn, at least set the initiative and then look to get more knowledge, because we all are actually contributing towards the ethics being applied and implemented. So my other question though was in relation to the algorithmic biases. What are the initiatives in particular for, I'd say, the likes of IBM, Google? What are the initiatives that they're participating and supporting to weed out? Because I think we all kind of recognize that, what you can buy off the shelf or whatever's been produced, naturally, because of human intervention, has biases. But what are the initiatives that we're supporting to cleanse and to kind of retrospectively, rectify those issues?
Okay, next question, and then go ahead.
Cheers.
Quick as possible, please.
I was just going to say thanks for organising this. Better than work. Awesome. I was going to say that the language here has been quite focused on use cases, and I'm quite interested in another word, which is sectors. And so I'm really curious to know, obviously procurement can be a really powerful tool to not just create markets, but also shape them. And I was wondering from a public policy perspective, where do you see potentially a divergence in treating different sectors differently from a procurement perspective? Because obviously, some of them might have, quite different market impacts and opportunities. So navigating those trade-offs might be a little different. So I'd be curious to hear about that.
That's great. One more, and then everybody 30 seconds, and we're going to get the Looney Tunes.
Sorry, just from a perspective of a data scientist who's resigned from more than one organization where leaders are not engaging in some of these great, sort of frameworks and ideas that you are sharing today, do you have any advice for individuals who are working in organizations where there's some resistance or friction from leadership to engage in the ethical frameworks that we're talking about?
That's great. So everyone, culture, leadership, and sectors that are focused on this. Let's do Joel all the way down to Sue. We'll go quick.
Wow. This was the rapid fire round, right? So I'm not sure I can answer 3 questions in 20 seconds. Fair play for leaving, being principled, being purpose-led, keep leaving organizations that aren't listening. I think what we'll start to see a little bit more of in the future is real-world impacts that drive impact at the bottom line in terms of fine, reputational damage. So I think those case studies will give you some evidence to hold up to those grown-ups to say this is why you should be paying attention. Great that this is better than work. I think for those of us in the field, I said our organization is a procurement consultancy organisation, essentially. So I'm paid to have conversations like this, and that's why I wake up smiling, because it's an amazing environment to be in, and it's great to still be able to have conversations, in audiences and in communities like today, which help to shape the future of what we're doing as an industry.
So I think, all really good questions. In my case, use cases, in some case, analogous to sector. There are very specific things depending on the sector. Financial services is different than healthcare. Healthcare is different than oil and gas. And the use cases in those contexts are important, but that's kind of, I think, a good piece. There are companies that have called me and offered me a ridiculous amount of money that I won't even have a conversation with you. I think the best way to impact a company you're in is create a business case. There is a tremendous amount of value in doing the right thing. There is a tremendous amount of consumer support for doing the right thing. And if a company doesn't listen to a value-driven use case to do the right thing, find another job. And I think, in terms of algorithmic impact on bias, as I said earlier, bias that we talk about in AI is actually bias that is originated from the humans involved in the process. AI can actually help us create a fairer society if we apply it correctly, if we have the proper controls in place. So I think absolutely AI can help us come out of this better, but we need things like this so that we can get assurance as technical professionals, but more importantly as business leaders and consumers, we can get assurance even if we don't understand what's going on in the process. And these algorithmic assessments and these explainabilities need to be able to be done on the end point, on the use case, without having to look inside, because there's some things we can't look inside of.
And forcing it so it creates that market demand.
Yeah, and perhaps impartial answer, incomplete answer to all the questions. I think we haven't talked a lot about the role of regulators today, which I do think we might get onto a bit more. There is, certainly in the UK and also elsewhere, there is lots going on in regulators to think about how AI impacts existing regulations, both on topics and in sectors. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK have just started a big stream of work looking at AI in the context of equalities regulation. Actually, algorithmic bias is regulated in the UK. We have the Equality Act 2010. There are quite strong rules around how you interpret that. That should make people in boardrooms care. I think part of the trick actually for data science teams is to make sure that when they're talking about algorithmic bias, that they aren't talking about what sounds like an obscure statistical metric, but they are talking in the language of the Equality Act and the language that really does land in boardrooms. Fundamentally, they're the same conversation in a different language. I think we could do a bit more at joining that up, and that actually helps both with organisations to move forward. I think it also helps individuals to kind of have an impact in explaining this. And I think the same also applies to sector regulators like the FCA. Lots of sector regulators starting to think about how do you interpret some of these good use cases for AI in the context of existing sector regulations.
Perfect, thank you, Sue.
And just one point, definitely seeing differences between sectors and applications. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all scenario. And I think the point there around, I think now where we're starting to build the tools for businesses to have the ability to assess their position and maturity against frameworks like the RAY framework, and also by building it into things like the procurement processes, then it will start to push out and become something that boards will become more and more aware of. And I think there's definitely something around that corporate social responsibility and ESG framework in the company accounts, and being able to put something in there that says they've got some structure around their thought processes on responsible AI and its use. So I think it may be that we're moving along the continuum, but hopefully we're moving a little bit quicker now.
Thank you so much, everyone. If you want to learn more about what we're doing, we're having an event tonight at Little Creatures at 5 p.m. So please feel free to join us, and you can ask all of these wonderful humans lots more questions. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm.